I didn't think twice when Kayla and I attended my brother-in-law's birthday party last spring. After all, family gatherings were a staple in our lives. My wife, radiant as ever, laughed a little too easily at Greg's jokes that night, but I brushed it off. They had always gotten along well. It wasn't uncommon for siblings-in-law to have a rapport. But things started feeling off. Kayla's phone, usually an open book, became a fortress of secrecy. Text notifications would light up her screen, and with a quick swipe, she'd dismiss them. She claimed work had been hectic lately, and as a successful event planner, she often got late-night calls. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? The catalyst for my doubt came during a Saturday barbecue at my in-laws' house. Kayla excused herself to help Greg prep the grill, and they were gone for an uncomfortable amount of time. When I went looking for them, I found them whispering in the garage, abruptly stepping apart as I entered. Greg gave me a nervous chuckle and blamed it on a secret party plan. It didn't sit right, but I played along. The turning point came one evening when Kayla was in the shower, and her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The message preview caught my eye. Can't wait for tomorrow. Same time? The sender's name? Greg. My chest tightened. My mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. I told myself it could be innocent, but deep down, I knew I had to confront the truth. After that text, I couldn't think straight. My stomach churned with doubt, anger, and something I hated to admit, fear. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but ignoring it wasn't an option. Kayla came out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, her damp hair falling over her shoulders. She flashed me that familiar smile, the one that used to make my world stop, and asked what was for dinner. I muttered something about takeout and left the room before my expression betrayed me. That night I barely slept. I replayed every interaction I had witnessed between Kayla and Greg. Her laughter at his jokes, their shared interests, the subtle moments I had dismissed as harmless. Were they harmless, or was I fooling myself? I needed proof, something concrete to quiet the storm in my head. The next morning, after Kayla left for her yoga class, I took a risk. I grabbed her phone. It was locked, of course. I tried a few common pins, her birthdate, our anniversary. Nothing worked. Frustrated, I put the phone back exactly as I found it. Plan B, I decided to reach out to someone who might know more. My sister, Lisa? Lisa and I had always been close, and she had a knack for picking up on things others missed. I invited her over under the pretense of needing advice about my work, but when she arrived, I went straight to the point. Lisa, I said, my voice low. I think something's going on between Kayla and Greg. Her face fell. You're serious? I nodded. I found a text on her phone last night from Greg. It didn't sound innocent. Lisa frowned, her eyes narrowing as she processed the information. I've noticed some things too, she admitted, her tone cautious. They've been weirdly close at family gatherings. I thought it was just Greg being Greg. He's always been flirty, but this. What do I do? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Lisa's expression hardened. We find out for sure. No accusations without proof. It's better if we're both on the same page when this blows up. I nodded, grateful for her support. We devised a plan to subtly keep an eye on them, tracking their interactions at upcoming family events and monitoring their social media for clues. Meanwhile, I decided to install a tracker app on Kayla's phone when I got the chance. It wasn't a move I felt proud of, but I needed answers. By the time Kayla came home that afternoon, I was calm, or at least I looked calm. Lisa had left, and I was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV. When Kayla kissed me on the cheek and asked how my day had been, I smiled, playing my part. Good, I said. Just the usual. The game had begun. The following days felt like a slow descent into madness. Kayla's behavior didn't change. If anything, she seemed happier. She laughed more, hummed to herself while cooking, and even suggested a weekend getaway for just the two of us. It should have reassured me, but instead, it felt like she was overcompensating. Lisa and I kept tabs on Greg at family events, At a dinner 2 nights later, we watched them carefully. Greg was unusually quiet, a stark contrast to his usual gregarious self. Meanwhile, Kayla barely looked at him the entire evening, which might have gone unnoticed if Lisa hadn't nudged me. "They're trying too hard," she whispered as we cleared plates from the table. "It's like they rehearsed this." I had to admit, it felt staged. Greg didn't crack any jokes, and Kayla avoided being near him altogether. It was unnatural, like they were tiptoeing around each other. Lisa and I exchanged a look. Something was definitely up. The breakthrough came when I finally got access to Kayla's phone. One evening, while she was in the shower again, I used a phone cloning app Lisa had suggested. My hands shook as I followed the steps, but within minutes, I had mirrored her messages and photos onto an old tablet. I tucked everything back in its place before she emerged. That night, after she fell asleep, I went through the cloned data in the guest room. Most of her messages were routine, texts with friends, work colleagues, reminders to herself, but then I found a thread with a contact saved as Julie. The texts weren't between Kayla and her friend Julie. They were between Kayla and Greg. The messages were vague but telling. "Same place tomorrow? I miss you. Can't stop thinking about last time. You're amazing. He'll be out of town for the weekend. Can't wait." My chest felt like it was caving in. The timestamps aligned with nights I'd worked late or been away for business trips. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. It was one thing to suspect, it was another to see it confirmed in black and white. I forwarded the text to myself and called Lisa. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy. "It's happening," I whispered. "I found the messages." Lisa was silent for a moment before she replied, her tone grim. "What do you want to do?" "We need a plan," I said. "We can't just confront them and let them lie their way out. We need something concrete." Lisa agreed, and we started brainstorming. She suggested using the upcoming family barbecue at Greg's house as an opportunity to gather evidence. Meanwhile, I decided to meet with a lawyer to understand my options if things escalated. That night, as I lay awake beside Kayla, who was sleeping soundly, I felt a wave of emotions: anger, betrayal, and a desperate need for justice. I had trusted her, built a life with her. And now, she was tearing it all apart, with my own brother-in-law, no less. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing: I wouldn't let them get away with this. The days leading up to the barbecue were excruciating. Every time Kayla smiled at me, every affectionate touch, every casual "I love you," felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But I played along. I had to. Lisa and I were working in tandem now, both determined to uncover the full truth. Lisa suggested we use the barbecue to observe Kayla and Greg in their natural habitat. If there was something still happening between them, they might let their guard down, even briefly. I had my doubts, they'd been careful so far, but it was worth a shot. The morning of the barbecue, Kayla was cheerful, bustling around the house, packing side dishes and drinks. She even put on her favorite sundress, the one I'd always said made her look radiant. I wondered if she had chosen it for me, or for Greg. "You seem excited," I said as she loaded the cooler into the trunk. She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It'll be nice to see everyone. You don't think it's weird how few family gatherings we've had this year?" My jaw tightened, but I forced a chuckle. "I guess everyone's just busy." As we pulled into Greg's driveway, I spotted Lisa standing by the grill, her husband chatting beside her. Lisa caught my eye and gave a small, subtle nod. We were on the same page. It was time to watch and wait. The barbecue was typical at first, kids running around, adults mingling over beers and burgers. Greg played the perfect host, cracking jokes and making sure everyone had what they needed. Kayla was her usual sociable self, flitting between conversations, never lingering too long near Greg. But then, something changed. I noticed it first when Greg slipped into the house. A few minutes later, Kayla followed. She didn't say anything, just carried an empty plate and disappeared inside. My pulse quickened. Lisa sidled up to me, her face calm but her voice low. "They're both in there," she said. "You think?" "Let's find out." We moved quietly, slipping away from the backyard chaos. Lisa stayed behind to keep an eye out while I made my way to the side of the house, where Greg's home office window was slightly ajar. At first, all I could hear was muffled voices. Then, Greg's unmistakable laugh. "You know I can't stop thinking about it," he said. "Greg, sure." Kayla's voice. "We have to be careful." "I'm careful." "You're worth it." My fist clenched at the words. I wanted to storm in, but I forced myself to wait, to gather more evidence. I fished out my phone and began recording the audio, every word another dagger in my chest. When the conversation ended and footsteps approached, I quickly ducked out of sight, my heart pounding. I circled back to the backyard, slipping in just before they emerged, Greg looking smug and Kayla smoothing her hair. They rejoined the party as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. I showed Lisa the recording later that night. Her expression darkened as she listened. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," she said, disgusted. "We need to take this further." "I agree," I said. "But not yet. Let them think they've gotten away with it." Lisa nodded, her determination matching my own. "We'll time this perfectly. When they fall, they won't see it coming." The trap was set. Now, we just had to wait. The barbecue had confirmed what I dreaded. Kayla and Greg were deep in their affair, and they didn't care how close they were to being caught. The next step was critical. Lisa and I needed undeniable proof to confront them, not just for the sake of clarity, but to ensure no one could twist the narrative when it all came crashing down. Lisa suggested hiring a private investigator. I hesitated at first. It felt extreme, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. This wasn't just about my marriage anymore. This was about protecting the truth in a situation where lies could tear our entire family apart. We hired a PI named Frank Gibson, a grizzled veteran with a reputation for discretion and results. I gave him every detail, the texts, the audio recording, even their suspicious behavior at the barbecue. Frank assured me he'd handle it, and within days, he was feeding me updates. It didn't take long for Frank to deliver the goods. Using GPS trackers and surveillance, he found a pattern. Kayla and Greg were meeting regularly at a motel on the outskirts of town. Frank captured time-stamped photos of their cars parked side by side, of them entering and leaving together, even holding hands. When Frank handed me the photos in a plain manila envelope, I thought I was ready. But seeing those images, Kayla smiling at Greg in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months, felt like being gutted. Lisa, sitting beside me, looked equally stricken. "This is it," she said, her voice firm. "We have everything we need." We decided on a two-pronged approach. Lisa would confront Greg, and I would confront Kayla, but not until we had orchestrated a family intervention. It was risky, but we agreed that dragging everything into the open was the only way to prevent lies from spinning out of control. In the meantime, I played the unsuspecting husband. Kayla continued to act like nothing was wrong, even planning a romantic dinner one evening to make up for all the time I've been busy lately. I went along with it, feeling every kiss, every touch, as a betrayal. The night before the intervention, Lisa called me. "Greg's been acting nervous," she said. "I think he suspects something." "Doesn't matter," I replied. "It's too late for them to cover this up." Lisa was quiet for a moment before saying, "You know this could destroy everything, right? Not just your marriage, but the whole family." "I know," I said. "But we can't let them destroy it themselves. This is the only way." We set the intervention for Sunday afternoon at Lisa's house, ensuring most of the family would be present. It was framed as a casual family meeting, something we occasionally did to stay connected. Kayla and Greg wouldn't suspect a thing. That night, as I lay in bed next to Kayla, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The life I had built, the trust one had given her, it was all a lie. But tomorrow, the truth would come out. Tomorrow, everything would change. Sunday afternoon arrived, heavy with anticipation. Lisa's house was the perfect setting, Neutral ground where the rest of the family wouldn't suspect a thing. Kayla spent the morning chatting about errands she wanted to run after the family meeting. Her calm demeanor only fueled my anger. How could she act so normal, knowing what she was doing behind my back? As family members trickled into Lisa's living room, the atmosphere felt warm and casual. Lisa greeted everyone with her usual charm, but I could see the tension in her eyes. Greg arrived late, as usual, cracking jokes about traffic. Kayla laughed at one of them, and I felt my stomach churn. We waited until everyone was settled before Lisa gave me a subtle nod. It was time. Lisa stood and cleared her throat. Hey everyone. Thanks for coming today. We've got something important to discuss, and Jack and I thought this would be the best way to do it. The room quieted, curious eyes shifting between Lisa and me. Greg leaned back in his chair, looking relaxed. Kayla glanced at me, her brow furrowing slightly. I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Lisa continued, her voice steady. Jack and I have recently discovered something devastating. Something that affects not just us, but this entire family. Murmurs spread across the room. Greg sat up a little straighter, his smile faltering. Kayla looked confused, or at least she pretended to be. What's going on? Kayla asked, her tone laced with unease. I stood, holding the manila envelope Frank had given me. My hands trembled slightly, but I steadied myself. Kayla, I said, locking eyes with her. I know. About you and Greg. The color drained from her face. What are you talking about? Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual confidence slipping. This is ridiculous, he scoffed. Jack, what are you accusing us of? I'm not accusing you of anything, I said, my voice low and firm. I have proof. I opened the envelope and slid the photos onto the coffee table for everyone to see. This is what I'm talking about. Gasps filled the room as the family leaned forward to look. The photos told the story better than I ever could. Kayla and Greg entering the motel, holding hands, and sharing moments that no brother-in-law and sister-in-law should ever share. Kayla's eyes widened as she stared at the evidence. Jack, it's not what it looks like, she stammered. It's exactly what it looks like, Lisa snapped, her voice sharp. She turned to Greg, her eyes blazing. How could you do this? To me? To your own brother-in-law? Greg opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. The silence that followed was deafening. Kayla broke it, her voice cracking. Jack, please, we can work through this. It was a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, my voice rising. You've been sneaking around with my brother-in-law for months. This wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. Repeatedly. Jack, calm down, Greg finally said, his tone defensive. We didn't mean for this to happen. Don't you dare try to play the victim. Lisa cut in, her voice trembling with rage. You've destroyed 2 families with your selfishness. The rest of the family sat in stunned silence, too shocked to intervene. My father-in-law, a stern man of few words, finally spoke up. Is this true? He asked Greg, his tone cold. Greg hesitated, his eyes darting between the photos and the expectant faces around him. Yes, he admitted, his voice barely audible. It's true. Kayla burst into tears, her sobs filling the room. But I felt no sympathy. Not anymore. This ends now, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. You both made your choices. Now you'll face the consequences. The family meeting had turned into a reckoning, and the fallout was only beginning. The silence that followed Greg's admission was deafening. Kayla sat hunched over, her face buried in her hands, while Greg stared at the floor, his usual smug confidence obliterated. The rest of the family looked between them, stunned. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Lisa stood abruptly, her face red with fury. How long? She demanded, her voice trembling. How long has this been going on? Greg hesitated, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. A few months, he muttered. It wasn't supposed to happen. We didn't mean for it to. Spare me the excuses, Lisa snapped. You're my husband. You've humiliated me. You've betrayed not just me, but our entire family. Kayla looked up then, her tear-streaked face a mask of desperation. Lisa, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you or Jack. Stop, I interrupted, my voice cold. Don't sit there and act like this wasn't deliberate. You made your choices, Kayla. Both of you did. My father-in-law, a man who rarely raised his voice, stood and fixed Greg with a withering glare. How could you do this? To your wife? To your brother-in-law? To all of us? Have you any idea what you've done to this family? Greg squirmed under the weight of his father's words but didn't respond. The shame in his expression was answer enough. Kayla reached for me then, her trembling hand brushing my arm. Jack, please, she whispered. Can't we talk about this? Privately? I still love you. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. I recoiled from her touch as if it burned. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is buying the wrong brand of coffee. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal. My voice cracked with the weight of my anger and heartbreak. There's no fixing this. Kayla's tears came harder now, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I stood and turned to Lisa. Let's go, I said. We're done here. Lisa nodded, her face hard with resolve. Together, we walked out, leaving Kayla and Greg to face the stunned stares and disappointed whispers of our family. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper. Lisa leaned against the hood of her car, shaking her head. I can't believe this is my life, she muttered. Same, I said, leaning beside her. For a moment neither of us spoke, both of us processing the emotional wreckage we'd just unleashed. What now? She asked eventually, her voice quiet. We follow through, I said. No second chances, no trying to work it out. They made their choice, and we'll make ours. Lisa nodded, but I could see the pain in her eyes. I still can't believe he'd do this to me. To us. I put a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort I could. We'll get through this, I said. Together. Lisa straightened, brushing a tear from her cheek. They think they've won, you know. They think they've gotten away with it. But they haven't. Not yet. I met her gaze, seeing the same fire in her eyes that I felt in my chest. Let's make sure they don't. Inside the house, I knew the confrontation wasn't over. The rest of the family would demand explanations, apologies, and answers that Greg and Kayla likely couldn't give. But Lisa and I were done playing their game. The time for waiting was over. Now, it was time to plan the next move. The day after the intervention, I woke up in the apartment I had rented just hours after walking out of Lisa's house. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, but it was quiet, and that was what I needed most. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Lisa. We need to talk, she said, her voice clipped. Meet me at my lawyer's office. Noon. I agreed without hesitation. If there was one thing I'd learned in the last 48 hours, it was that Lisa wasn't about to let Greg, or Kayla, get away with anything. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, Lisa was already there, sitting across from a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored suit. She introduced herself as Dana Wright, a specialist in high-conflict divorces. Lisa got straight to the point. I want to make sure Greg doesn't walk away from this unscathed, she said. And I want to know what options Jack has, too. Dana nodded, flipping open a notepad. We'll start with Greg. Given the evidence we've collected, including the photos and audio recordings, we can establish infidelity. While this state is no fault, proof of adultery can play a significant role in dividing assets and, if applicable, custody arrangements. Lisa shot me a glance. And Jack? Dana turned to me. Jack, your case is a little more complex since there aren't children involved. However, the evidence of Kayla's affair could still work in your favor during asset division, particularly if you can prove any marital funds were used to facilitate the affair, hotel stays, gifts, that sort of thing. My mind flashed to the PI's photos of the motel, and the texts Kayla had sent Greg about their special dinners. "I think we have that proof," I said, my voice firm. Dana smiled, a steely glint in her eye. "Good. That will strengthen your case. The next step is to officially file for divorce and begin gathering all financial records. We'll want to track any unusual expenditures or withdrawals." Lisa leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "What about the family? They're going to have questions. I don't want this to turn into a circus." Dana nodded. "It's up to you how much you want to share. My advice? Keep it factual. Let the evidence speak for itself. People will form their own opinions, but the truth is on your side." That evening, Lisa and I sat in my bare apartment, poring over documents. She had brought copies of Greg's financial records from their joint accounts, and I showed her the text messages and photos from the PI. "Look at this," Lisa said, pointing to a withdrawal for $500 marked as travel expenses. "This was the day he told me he was staying late at work. And here," I added, scrolling through Kayla's messages, "she transferred $300 to Greg's Venmo with a heart emoji. I don't think they're splitting dinner checks." Lisa snorted, her laugh bitter. "It's disgusting. But it's enough." Together, we began assembling a timeline, matching the financial discrepancies with the dates and locations from the PI's report. By the time we finished, the picture was clear. Kayla and Greg had been funding their affair with money from both our marriages. "That's it then," I said, leaning back in my chair. "We have everything we need." Lisa nodded, her jaw tight. "Let's take them down." The next step was filing. Dana had already prepared the paperwork for both of us. Lisa served Greg the following morning, delivering the documents with icy composure. I waited until Kayla came home from work that evening to hand her mine. "What's this?" she asked, her eyes widening as she read the first page. "Divorce papers," I said flatly. "It's over, Kayla." She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. "Don't bother lying. I know everything. About you and Greg. About the money you used to sneak around. It's all documented." Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. I turned and walked out, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Lisa and I knew the hardest battles were still ahead. Greg and Kayla wouldn't go down without a fight, and the family would inevitably get dragged into the mess. But we were ready. We had the truth, we had the evidence, and now, we had the law on our side. The game was no longer about survival, it was about winning. Filing for divorce had been a bold first move, but it also unleashed a wave of fallout I hadn't fully anticipated. Word spread quickly among the family, and soon, Lisa and I were fielding calls from relatives demanding explanations. Some were supportive, others incredulous, and a few seemed determined to play peacemakers. My mother-in-law called me the morning after Kayla was served. "Jack, this is all just a big misunderstanding," she said, her tone pleading. "I'm sure if you and Kayla sit down and talk—" "We're past talking," I interrupted, my voice firm. "Ask Kayla to show you the proof I gave her. Then you'll understand." She fell silent, and I ended the call before she could press further. Lisa wasn't faring much better. Greg's older brother called her, alternating between apologies and excuses on Greg's behalf. "He's under a lot of stress," he said. "You know how he gets." "Stop," Lisa snapped. "I don't care how stressed he is. He destroyed our marriage and betrayed his family. Don't call me again unless you're ready to talk about him signing the divorce papers." Our decision to make the affair public had fractured the family. Some members sided with us, horrified by Greg and Kayla's actions. Others tried to downplay the betrayal, arguing that everyone makes mistakes. The tension reached its peak when my father-in-law called a family meeting at his house. The living room was packed with relatives when Lisa and I arrived. Greg and Kayla were there too, sitting at opposite ends of the couch. Kayla's face was pale, her eyes darting nervously. Greg, on the other hand, looked defiant, his arms crossed as if daring someone to challenge him. My father-in-law stood at the center of the room, his expression grim. "We're here to figure out how we move forward as a family," he began. This situation is painful for everyone, but we need to address it. Lisa spoke first, her voice steady but cold. There's nothing to figure out. Greg and Kayla betrayed us, plain and simple. The only reason this family is in pain is because of their selfish choices. Greg scoffed. Oh, come on, Lisa. Don't act like you were the perfect wife. You were always too busy criticizing me to even notice when I was unhappy. Lisa's eyes blazed. So your solution was to cheat with your brother-in-law's wife? Real mature, Greg. Kayla started crying, covering her face with her hands. I never wanted this to happen. She sobbed. Jack, please, I still love you. Stop, I said sharply, my voice cutting through the room. You don't get to play the victim. You and Greg made this mess. Lisa and I are just cleaning it up. The room erupted into arguments, with relatives shouting over each other. Some tried to defend Greg and Kayla, while others demanded accountability. My mother-in-law begged for everyone to calm down, but her voice was drowned out in the chaos. Finally, Lisa's voice rose above the din. Enough! She shouted. This family can decide whether it wants to support Jack and me or sweep this under the rug. But Greg and Kayla's actions have consequences, and those consequences start now. She looked directly at Greg, her voice icy. I've already filed for divorce. Don't think for a second that you'll walk away unscathed. I turned to Kayla. And you? You've lost me. You've lost the life we built together. I hope it was worth it. The room fell silent, the weight of our words hanging heavy in the air. Greg and Kayla looked stunned, as if they hadn't expected us to be so resolute. My father-in-law finally spoke, his tone weary. This family will never be the same, he said. But if we're going to heal, we need to let the chips fall where they may. Lisa and I nodded, knowing we had allies in the room but also knowing that some bonds were beyond repair. As Lisa and I left the house, we felt a strange sense of relief. The battle wasn't over, but we had stood our ground. Whatever came next, we would face it together. Months of legal battles led to the day we knew was coming, a courtroom showdown that would lay everything bare. Lisa and I had worked closely with our lawyers, piecing together an airtight case that painted a clear picture of betrayal and financial misconduct. Greg and Kayla had tried to push back, but the weight of evidence was firmly on our side. The courtroom was small but felt enormous as we walked in. Lisa and I sat side by side, a united front. Across the aisle, Greg and Kayla avoided our gazes. Greg looked haggard, his usual bravado replaced by a sullen expression. Kayla, on the other hand, seemed to be trying for sympathy, her face pale and tear-streaked. The proceedings began with our lawyers presenting the timeline of the affair. The PI's photos, text messages, and financial records were all laid out for the judge to see. Every detail was scrutinized: the motel visits, the money funneled into secret rendezvous, even the casual lies they told to cover their tracks. Kayla's lawyer attempted to argue that the affair was a symptom of a broken marriage, but my lawyer quickly dismantled that claim. Mr. Meyer's marriage was broken by his wife's choice to engage in an extramarital relationship with her brother-in-law, she said firmly. The evidence speaks for itself. Greg's lawyer didn't fare much better. When confronted with the financial records showing how marital assets were used to fund the affair, Greg stammered out an apology that sounded rehearsed. Lisa sat stone-faced, her anger tempered by the knowledge that justice was being served. When it was Kayla's turn to speak, she stood shakily, her voice trembling. Jack, I'm sorry, she began, addressing me directly. I made a terrible mistake. I let my emotions cloud my judgment, and I hurt you more than I can ever make up for. Please believe me, I never wanted to lose you. I stared at her for a moment, weighing my response. Finally I spoke, my voice steady. You didn't just lose me, Kayla. You lost the life we built, the trust we had. And that's on you. She broke down, tears streaming down her face, but I felt nothing. My sympathy had run dry long ago. Greg didn't even try to apologize. When the judge questioned him about his actions, he mumbled something about things getting out of hand, and avoided eye contact. Lisa leaned over to me and whispered, Typical Greg, no backbone. The judge's ruling came swiftly. Lisa was granted the lion's share of marital assets, citing Greg's financial misconduct and betrayal. I walked away with similar terms. Kayla's pleas for leniency fell flat in light of the evidence. There were no winners in that courtroom, but Lisa and I left with a sense of vindication. As we exited, the media caught wind of the case, photographers snapping pictures as we walked down the courthouse steps. Lisa and I kept our heads high, determined not to let this scandal define us. That evening, Lisa and I met for dinner, a quiet celebration of our newfound freedom. "It's over," she said, raising her glass. "Finally." "Not quite," I replied, clinking her glass. "But it's a new beginning." Over the following weeks, Lisa and I began to rebuild our lives. The family was still fractured, but the truth had cleared the air. Those who sided with Greg and Kayla were distant now, and that was fine by us. The ones who stayed understood the pain we had endured, and the strength it had taken to fight back. Kayla moved out of town not long after the divorce was finalized. Greg's reputation was in tatters, both in the family and his professional circles. Lisa and I stayed in touch, our shared ordeal forging an unbreakable bond. Life wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again.